I remember one day I got in very early in the morning, like at 5:30 in the morning, and I was working in the same building as Bill Gates. His car was already there. It was a Porsche convertible. It was summer, and in the passenger seat were 10 big books on networking and coding. And I thought to myself, this guy, he's in already this morning, and in his spare time, he was doing a little side light reading. I mean, are you kidding? And, Bill would do things like have a think week where he would go off and think about the big issues facing the company for a week. He was doing things others just hadn't done in the same way. We believed we were changing the world. And I was really excited. And I had a cot in my office and I would sleep overnight sometimes. And it's funny when I hear about people today saying, don't work more than 40 hours a week. Oh my gosh, that is the opposite. I mean, people didn't say work 80 hours a week. You did it because you were excited about what we were working on. And that was the atmosphere there.
Today's guest was a VC investor in over 400 companies, including Docusign. I believe their last valuation was $16 billion, Facebook. He's had 4 different funds and over $1 billion managed in assets. He's also the founder of Agate Hound Fund, a fund of funds for search. He was there when the first initial studies were being published about search funds and this entire world at Stanford in 1984, if I'm not getting my dates wrong. Jon, welcome to the Builders and Funders Show.
Excited to be here, Burke. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, Jon, I want to talk about one of your personal heroes to start this interview off, Warren Buffett. You talk about how your journey started in his 4th of July celebration in Omaha, Nebraska. Tell me about that. Tell me about how Warren Buffett has shaped much of your career.
Well, Warren is a hero of mine. And it's okay to have heroes. We don't talk about heroes very much anymore. It's funny. It's almost like that's been diluted out of the conversations. But Warren's an absolute hero. Warren is a guy I still go back and read the annual reports. He's on my feed on my social media because I want to be reminded of his wisdom. And he's a guy that the times I've made mistakes in my life, I didn't follow Warren. And one of the things I love most about Warren is that he says he skips to work, that work isn't work, right? And I've always tried to have that mindset for myself. I'm getting older, and yet I'm not retiring. I have no interest in retiring because I love what I'm doing. And Warren is 93, 94 years old. I go back to Omaha for the annual meeting every year because I love the energy that he gives off and that people feel when they're around him. He's a stalwart figure. He's got integrity. He's got wisdom. He's just a guy that anybody who's interested in business should be reading about him. They should be listening to him. And he's a throwback. He talks about things. Someone yesterday was telling me about reading the Iliad and the Odyssey because those same lessons are pertinent today. And I feel like Warren represents that kind of base of knowledge and wisdom that you just can't, it never goes out of fashion. It never goes out of style. It's just the right thing to do if you pay attention to it. And so many mistakes could be avoided. So sorry, I first of all, he's also from Omaha, where I'm from, and I'm such a fanboy of Omaha and the Midwest and the great people there that I love that all came together. And honestly, Warren, when I was growing up, wasn't Warren. He was just a guy, we went to his house sometimes. And only later in life, now I wish my parents had invested in Berkshire. That would have been great. But he's just a guy, and he lives in the same house. And he's got, he's not about things. He's about living life. And again, that's a model that I want to live up to as well.
It's interesting you say that. When I saw I think it was the interview with him, and he was showing off his, little Nokia phone. He's like, I don't even have an iPhone. I actually got one for myself as well. I was like, you know what? If Warren Buffett has it, I'm gonna go get myself one of these Nokia flip phones. I literally was using it, and I was in high school. I must have been junior or senior. And like people would look at me like, "Are you dealing drugs? Why do you have a burner Nokia phone?" I'm like, you don't get it. Warren Buffett has one. I'm getting one. Screw the iPhone. And my parents would text me. I'd have to go like one by one, like press on all these buttons and be like, hey, here's like it'd take me an hour to text back.
Hey man, it's no coincidence that your name is Burke.
Berkshire Hathaway. There you go. So you mentioned a lot of mistakes in your career came from actually not listening to Warren Buffett's wisdom. Tell me about that, like some of those mistakes that you made when you kind of didn't listen to his advice.
Well, Warren makes a great point about not needing. We're lucky in life, unlike in baseball. We don't ever have to swing. We don't have three strikes and you're out kind of thing. You don't have to. You can pick the pitch to swing at that is obvious to you. You can be patient. And when I got in trouble and made my mistakes is when I went too fast, when I just did too many things. And that's a part of my nature because I'm a doer and I love being super active. But I always have to remind myself, slow down. If it isn't patently obvious, if it isn't a hell yes, then why am I doing it? And I'm better and I'm still working on that. But that's a perfect example of Warren's wisdom. And I would say when I've gotten in trouble, it's when I moved too quickly, I wasn't being clear in my thinking, and it wasn't a hell yes.
Interesting. You mentioned picking where to take swings, picking your pitch, and like being mindful about that. A lot of young people I spoke to, any investor or entrepreneur that I talk to, I always like to ask them about how they pick stuff to work on, the stuff that excites them, because I think that's one of the most important things to do. You were an early employee at Microsoft, and Bill Gates obviously picked his thing when he was around my ages, and he was like, you know what, this is why I have my convictions around. How do you decide what problems to work on, what you find interesting? Does that just come naturally to you? Like Jeff Bezos says, you don't find your passions find you. Is that kind of how you think about it, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I do actually. And I think, first of all, again, I have a bias. I never want to give advice and suggest it's for everyone. So you kind of got to know who you are as a person. I know as a person that I find ideas, find passions, and they find me, to your point, by going to conferences, by meeting a lot of people, by reading a lot of books, by exposing myself to many, many things. And some people, that's not their style, that's not how they're going to find it. But for me, that's always been. I was one of those crazy readers growing up. I would not only read books, but I would go through magazines. I would consume them. And I would think about the ideas and I would be inspired. I love to be inspired. Entrepreneurship has always inspired me. And I think it's partly because my family was a small business family. My dad was an entrepreneur. He did things very few people had done in rethinking garden apartments in Nebraska. So he was very entrepreneurial. My mom was entrepreneurial. They started businesses. And so that's always been part of my DNA. What some people view as risk, I don't view probably in the same way. My tolerance for risk is probably higher. I remember when I having gone to Stanford, I was around venture earlier than most. So that exposed me to it, right? And I also believe no matter where you are, there's inspiration. So I don't care if you're at Wayne State University or you're in Lisbon, Portugal, there's going to be cool things going on, especially true today, even more so. But I was at Stanford and I had known about venture. And I thought to myself, I had uh, done some real estate before business school, and I loved real estate. I do like real estate today. I love the deal. I like thinking about putting together deals and putting together the people and thinking strategically about how to get to an outcome. And venture carried all that. In addition to it, I love learning. So for me, venture is a constant opportunity, literally every day, to learn about something new. And with the explosion of change and the explosion of technology, I feel like the luckiest guy in the world. Because literally every day I'm learning about something I hadn't thought about, or where the world is moving to, what the future might look like. What That's like I'm in heaven. I cannot think of anything better than that, right? I'm a lifelong learner, and I set myself in a role that allows me to do that. Now, you can do that in a bunch of different ways, but for me, this was a perfect way to combine my love of doing deals, my love of finance, my love of people, my love of entrepreneurship, and my love of learning.
Interesting. We're going to get into venture in a second here, but something you did was you actually went to work for Microsoft kind of in the early days after Stanford, I believe. Tell me about we're going to talk about, then how you transitioned over to doing deals and doing venture and how you built your first few funds,
Yeah,
but
sure.
I've always been curious about like the first early days, and I think you've talked about in that previous podcast how they wouldn't hire people with just big resumes and fancy experiences, but just like young, hungry people who just were just obsessed with that mission. But tell me about those. Like, take me back down memory lane into those moments.
Well, honestly, I was not going to go to a company like Microsoft. I was going to do something entrepreneurial out of business school. But I ended up going up for the interview. A friend of mine encouraged me, and I'd never been to Seattle. And so, John likes to travel and John likes to see new places. So let's go to Seattle. But I started doing the interviews, and the interviews themselves were so interesting and so challenging. And the people that were engaging, it wasn't rote, it was an engagement of a conversation. And they valued my opinion, and I learned from them, and they were hard. And I thought, if this is the kind of atmosphere and the kind of people they have, this is a great fit for me. I've always believed in the Ken Burns notion of, take on ideas that you're a little bit afraid of. And I was intimidated. There are really smart people at Microsoft, but that's good because I mean, in the back of my mind, I kind of always say to myself, what's the worst that's going to happen here, right? And generally, it's not so bad, right? And so I said, why not? I'll take a risk on this company. And by the way, back then it was a couple thousand people, and literally everybody who was working there was so passionate and so tenacious and so smart that it was like being in a mental health spa every day. It was, I would have conversations and I would see things in a whole new light. I was learning, and there were no playbooks, right? We were creating playbooks, and we thought and we believed we were changing the world. And that was really exciting. And Bill's a hero of mine. I mean, say what you want about him, but he is so brilliant and so passionate and so tenacious. It really filtered down from Bill. And those days were like, get on the horse, because we're riding. And I had a cot in my office, and I would sleep overnight sometimes. And it's funny when I hear about people today, Facebook or one of these big companies saying, don't work more than 40 hours a week. Oh my gosh, that is the opposite. I mean, people didn't say work 80 hours a week. You did it because you were excited about what we were working on. And that was the atmosphere there. And we were competitive as hell. They hired competitive people. We wanted to win. And I happen to like and thrive in that kind of environment.
I think it's safe to say, I guess, if you're like an 18-year-old like me and you're thinking, what do I do? chances are, if you find an environment like that or cultivate it yourself, that's actually probably one of the best things to do when you're young. It seems like, at least that's my big takeaway. Like, you were sleeping in your office, but that wasn't because you want or had to. You wanted to. You were excited about
I
what
did.
you were doing.
And
Looking
by the way,
back, like,
Burke, you're making the right point. I also did all nighters when I worked on Wall Street at Lehman Brothers, but I didn't like that. Right? There's a huge difference. Like I felt like it was made up work. Like I did not need to be there. That my managing director was off on his boat for the weekend and said, "Why don't you work on this on the weekend?" That I knew after that summer working at Lehman Brothers, I did not want to do that job. But at Microsoft, I did whatever it took because I was excited about what we were working on.
and I guess you could say like that kind of maniacal intensity of like not just one person but the entire team just coming together to be so upset. I guess that's what drives a lot
Yeah.
of change in the world, and that's what makes these companies successful. Like, I think when I was reading Elon Musk's biography, and both by Ashley Vance and Walter Isaacson, they reference him literally sleeping in the conference room in his factories when there were production delays and going to what they call as demon mode. I guess that's what it takes to build some of those successful companies, right? That's certainly what it seems like.
That's certainly one of the key drivers to Microsoft's success. And you know, I'm one of those old guys who looks now at younger people and thinks, if you're not willing to do that, someone else is going to be willing to do that, and you will get your lunch handed to you. We'll see. Maybe the world's changed, but I am old school that way, and I still believe effort in can often lead to great results out.
Fascinating. If you could, like, you mentioned sleeping in your office, pulling all nighters, and like you were excited. What are some other, just to like really drive the point home? What were some other memories that stand out to you about that period of time, and how you guys thought you were changing the world? Are there any other like stories, like memories that you just keep cherishing from those times?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, little ones that were just reminders of how amazing the place was. I remember one day I got in very early in the morning, like it's 5:30 in the morning, and I was working in the same building as Bill Gates, and his car was already there, and it was a Porsche convertible. It was summer, and in the passenger seat were 10 big books on networking and coding. And I thought to myself, this guy ultimately is the ultimate geek. And he doesn't stop learning. And I thought, A, he's in already this morning. And in his spare time, he was doing a little side light reading. I mean, are you kidding? And Bill would do things like have a think week where he would just nobody he would go off and think about the big issues facing the company for a week and come back with a memo. And like that kind of he was doing things others just hadn't done in the same way. I loved the idea that, like you said, it's funny today, the remote worker. So much of what happened at Microsoft was the hall conversation, were the meetings, were the even the fun we had. Like they had a campus, kind of it was interesting. Now it's a commonplace thing, but back then it wasn't. We had soccer fields, we had playgrounds. They were walking past to get out in nature. It was a true campus. It felt like being at college. And I know college hasn't been great for a lot of people in the last few years. College for me was awesome. And so for me, extending what I loved about college into my career job felt like a perfect fit. And they understood. And now it's been taken to whole new levels and so forth and so on. But again, back then, that was a cool thing. And not a lot of people have done that. Pardon me.
That's fascinating. I remember like the thing you mentioned about remote work. A lot of people got pissed off at me at Twitter when I commented something about how I hated remote work and the idea of it as an 18-year-old, and people were saying, "Yeah, you're young, you don't have a family, and all this stuff." And I just remember, I think I was like 16, so this must have been like 2 years ago. I was a junior in high school, and I flew out to California to meet some stranger I had met on Twitter because he had raised $2.5 million. He was building his venture-backed startup, and I thought, you know what, I really want to work with you guys. Just please, at least pay for the Airbnb for me to stay there. At least, like, I'll sleep on someone's couch. I don't care. Literally, just give me a piece of your floor, or like I'll even sleep in the WeWork. I genuinely don't care if that's what it comes down to. I'm willing to take a sleeping bag, go in the WeWork. And I remember as soon as I got there, just the energy, the sitting in the WeWork, the talking about these, like that was probably some of the best times in my life. And like you said about Microsoft, I was literally, as we would drive to lunch, I would be working on my laptop in the car. They'd be like, you don't have to do that, right? And I was like, no, but I want to. Like, this is fun for me. This feels like play. I'm surrounded by people. We're building something. Like, how can life get any better? And I begged to stay there. I couldn't. I had to go back to high school. But with the
Exactly.
remote work thing, I do want to ask you, where do you think, like, Spotify just said our employees aren't babies and we don't require them to come to the office. Amazon saying you have to. There's kind of this little tug of war going on. I want to get your take on that before we move on real quick.
I don't know if the cat's out of the bag. I am old school. I do think good things happen when people on teams come together in person. Okay, I know for me that when I'm working with people, there's a lot more energy, there's a lot more ideation that happens. Now, maybe going forward, that changes, and that's a different deal. But I appreciate Andy Jassy saying, "Hey, everybody, we got to get back to work." And some people aren't going to like that, and I guess that's just a choice people are going to have to make. And people have moved, and I get it. But all things in balance, being equal, I would say I think being together in an office, a cool, make it a cool office setting, but where you can meet people and talk to people and exchange ideas and riff on ideas, that seems to me to be a better answer than just remote.
Interesting.
It
Yeah,
worked. I enjoy it. So I guess maybe I'm just biased because I enjoy it.
yeah, I guess you could say, like, especially if you're building any kind of startup and you've got like small team of just young, hungry people, it's a lot more useful to be in person than trying to remote. But if you're like working at Lehman Brothers or well, no longer Lehman Brothers, but some other big Wall Street firm, then it would make sense to maybe try and do remote.
Well, and look, the world's changed, and I don't think it's a black and white question. Um, but when you get everybody on the same page and everybody's psyched and everybody believes in a mission and the culture is right, it's very powerful.
Absolutely. And then after, Microsoft, you start going to venture and you start by putting just like groups of people together to go, talk about deals and review deals. I want to talk about that moment in your
Yeah, the
life.
original SPVs is really what they
Yeah,
were. SPVs are again a common thing, but they weren't that common back then, right? And so that's really what those were, and that was 30 years ago. Find a deal and then go get a set of investors who, so, as opposed to a blind pool fund, every deal we kind of had to explain and sell and get people excited about. And we had to do the due diligence to make sure it was a good deal in the first place. And it was a great training. It was great training for the due diligence piece, for this learning how to package a deal, getting comfortable with the deal, because I always put my own money in, and any one of these deals always have. Selling the deal, getting to know people who might find this interesting. That was great training that ultimately led me to create an actual, what we call today, a normal venture fund. Um, but it started, when I was doing it, there weren't a lot of people that even knew the term venture fund, right? Which is, everyone smiles when I say that today because it's such a common word. And so I actually had to explain that you might lose all your money. There's considerable risk that you will lose all your money. And people had to get comfortable with that. But the alternative was maybe we'll make 10, 20, 30, 40 times our money, and that's the opportunity. But that was a shift in mindset And so it was fun. It was fun to kind of evangelize that and be on the forefront of that.
Interesting. So you're putting these, special purpose vehicles together. You're finding these deals. Tell me about those early deals that you were scouting. What were those companies, and why did you pick them specifically?
Well, I worked at a firm, and there were several of us. It was kind of a boutique investment banking firm, and so as part of what they did is they helped startups raise some money. So we would get startups coming in, and we had to decide if we thought it merited our effort and time to go out and help them um, put together the raise for them, right? And so it really, and they were mostly, in fact, they were all Washington deals and mostly Seattle deals. And it wasn't a very well constructed um, ecosystem at that time. So it was, as I said, it was a lot of education. Um, we had to coach the companies on even how to put together a deck, of course, because there weren't the same resources there are today. You can go online today, and there are playbooks for how to be a founder, how to raise a round, how to hire. Right? None of that existed back then. Right? So I kind of feel like we actually were adding a ton of value because this stuff didn't exist, and so we were learning and we were coaching, and that piece of it it's kind of gone today. I mean, it's funny to me how many startups today feel like, oh yeah, we know all that. Just write us the check. We're good. Get out of the way. We already know all of it. That wasn't the case back then. That was one of the things I loved and appreciated about the ecosystem at the time. It was in formation.
Interesting. And then I think we talked about some of your most successful investments. Obviously, there's a long list there, but we mentioned Docusign and Facebook. If you could tell me about the story behind those.
Well, again, the nice thing about being in the game is, and I'm a connector. I'm always playing the game with people. What's the over under on how many people we know in common on LinkedIn? And to most people's surprise, it's higher than they would have expected. So I embraced getting a network early. I just saw the value of it to the companies I was working with. And so in all those cases, it's just me being at the right, being there. Like what's the line? 99% of life is showing up. So I showed up, right? And I would do, gosh, 25 years ago, I was doing something called Schmooze Fest in Seattle. And at one point we had thousands of people every event. They got too big. We had to shut them down. But I love bringing people together. And it's like right now I'm down here at Art Basel in Miami. And I love art. But I also know I'm going to have really interesting conversations with people doing really cool stuff. And I don't know what's going to come out of it. But I just went to an event last night where I met 3 people who all were going to exchange information and share some ideas, and who knows what will come. So, long answer to your question. Tell me about those. Well, people knew I was doing venture, and there weren't that many people doing venture, and hopefully I'm a good guy, and there's like the no jerk rule generally applies when people are raising money, right? So you want people that add value and are hopefully good people you want to work with, and hopefully enough times that people have said, yeah, he fits that criteria. We should let him know about this opportunity.
Something I've noticed over and over again as I do these interviews is it seems like the best thing you can do if you're building or you're investing is put yourself in positions to get lucky, and then you just end up getting lucky if you stay in those positions long enough. So, building stuff, doing interesting stuff, being a good person, being known as a good person, and then just putting yourself out there. And eventually you get lucky. That seems like it's the biggest takeaway. Where like even you mentioned you're putting these groups together, you're doing these big events, and you're just trying to be as useful as possible, connecting people together. And at some point, you're just in that position to get lucky. And if you're a good enough person, those opportunities, they come along.
Yeah, I mean, what was the line? Luck is the residue of design, and getting lucky. You put yourself. You said it. You put yourself in a position to be there when the opportunity strikes, and that's what I've been trying to do. But you got to appreciate the fact that life is give and take, and life is how do you create value for others, right? And hopefully that comes back to you, the concept of karma. And I believe in that. And, be a good person, have integrity, and add value, and good things will happen.
You mentioned you were meeting a lot of different people, and something we talked about. We started the interview talking about Warren Buffett, someone who's made a great impact on you. What are some other people that jump out from that period in your life that really stood out to you, that made an impression on you, that were really memorable, that maybe taught you something that ended up in an inflection point in your career? Are there any stories that come to mind, or any memories that come to mind from meeting people in that period of your life?
Well, so many people. I guess I'll give you one, two people. One maybe not as obvious as the other. I'll start with one of my original managers at Microsoft, a guy by the name of Ron. And Ron taught me storytelling, believe it or not. Ron, you'd go in and you'd want to talk to Ron about something, but before you ever got to what you wanted to talk about, Ron had a story. And it was this incredible ability, A, to build rapport. B, he would make points with his story, right? He'd be making a point. And C, you felt like it wasn't just about a transaction, that there was a real relationship there. And so the value of storytelling, I wish I was a better storyteller. Storytellers, that is a gift, and it is a powerful gift. And I will never forget the number of times I think about Ron all the time as that, right? And he made me a better person through the art of his storytelling. And and he, by the way, that was the way he navigated Microsoft. Microsoft was pretty intense. You probably got that sense. And everybody had to figure out their way to navigate it. And that's the way he did it, and it was super powerful. Another guy was somebody that was a pretty well-known guy, actually. His name is Roger. And we just hit it off. Early on, I just showed up and I did all the things we talked about, and we became friends. I mean, when I was sick a few years ago, Roger was a guy that called me at the hospital and said, "Hey, how are you doing?" And one day I was at a conference, an investment banking conference in San Francisco, and I saw Roger and we're catching up, and he said, "Hey, I have the best idea I've ever had. Would you like to be part of it?" And honestly, it was an extraordinary deal. And when you looked at the cap table, it was every big name and then my little venture fund. And it was kind of hilarious to look back that I was even involved or allowed to be on that cap table. So again, I think this comes back to our overall point of um, the network and the friends you keep. You never know. Build bridges. I can't stress that enough. Build bridges. Life can be, you'll be surprised at how many times this stuff comes around and around. And I keep thinking to myself, with AI, it's going to even come around more, because with AI, in 10 years, every interaction you've ever had with people, you're going to walk into a room and your virtual reality or augmented reality glasses are going to say, "Oh, that person you met 7 years ago, that person you met 12 years ago, here's what you talked about." So building bridges has never been more important from that perspective. And that's just served me really well. And it's something I like doing because I'm genuinely interested in people. One of the things I did in high school is I was a journalist. I wrote for the newspaper and for the yearbook. And like you, Burke, you like getting to know people. You like asking questions. And I do too. I love what you're doing. In fact, I've often thought I should have a podcast. I'm envious. And that, if you use that genuine interest throughout your career, that's going to serve you.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed with every time I have any kind of sales call for any company I build, I notice that very little of the conversation is actually selling, and most of it's just bonding and being genuinely curious. And the conversation goes in so many different directions, but you often end up building such a cool relationship. So I want to go back to Ron from Microsoft, storytelling. So you mentioned the thing that stood out was his ability to storytell. You mentioned you wish you had this ability to tell stories like him. What do you think made him so good at telling stories? Like, do you think that's just
Well, I know
something?
what made Ron really good at it. Ron, at 17 years old, was managing a bar in the French Quarter in New Orleans. And so every single day, that guy was surrounded by characters and other storytellers. And it was like the perfect training if you want to be a storyteller, right? And he would tell me those stories. And I was super impressed with, he wasn't your traditional, at the time, Microsoft did hire a lot of MBAs from top business schools. Ron was not that. He was street smart, he was gritty, and he had this passion for learning, but he loved people too. And so his storytelling, what I appreciated, he stood out from everybody else because his approach was not the same. He took his strengths, which weren't the same mainstream strengths of many others at the company, but because of that, people remembered him, wanted to work with him, knew that it was not only a guy that was going to get stuff done, but someone you liked working with.
A lesson I'm picking up on is so like when I asked another interviewee of mine, I said, how do you, so like he's got 2 million students and he's like, yeah, he's at TED Talks, etc. And I asked him, how do you get good at public speaking? Like you're a great speaker. And he says, well, go and study people who speak well and people who've given great speeches and at some point you will start emulating them. It seems like that's kind of the big lesson there where as he's working this job at 17, because he's seeing so many different people and their styles of telling
That's right.
stories, he ends up inevitably just picking up on those cues. So almost like just intentionally listen and you'll eventually start emulating. Am I right on that observation?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think about, not to get too far off course here, but I think about our Sunday dinners, family Sunday dinners that we would have every Sunday with cousins and family and and the arguments and the discussions and everything was open. And that made me always want to engage and not be afraid of it and not shy away from it and to relish other people's opinions and to try and present my opinion and try and convince and debate. And so I was around that. So I'm naturally comfortable with that. So yeah, I think that's right, Berg.
Interesting. Something that you mentioned in another interview of yours that I wish more people talked about, and this is why I want to ask you about it again. Something you said was a lot of people often when there's some new tech, new trend, there's a lot of haste to get in on it. There's just a lot of people are worried, am I too late? I need to get in, and they end up making really emotional moves. And something you mentioned was if you got in on Amazon early and when it IPO'd, you invested, you would have lost money for like a long time. It was not profitable. Its stock wasn't doing particularly well. And so actually being late or quote unquote late to the party would actually have been an advantage. You would have made more money if you were a little bit late. So tell me about that point because I think that more people need to hear about that.
Again, I go back to Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett traditionally has said, I'm a buy and hold guy, right? If it's a good business and the good people running it, we want to buy it and we want to hold it, and it should continue to be a good business. If it has the moat, it'll keep the moat. Um, and you know, I think about Microsoft, and uh, when I when I joined, I got a few options, some shares, and I ended up buying my first house because of that. Not a big house, but very happy to have made that move. But if I had held on to that Microsoft stock, I will not say the number, but it would have been a really big number, right? Now, you don't know, and there's lots of reasons for taking profits or getting out of things. But I do think humans tend to take a short term view on most things, and that generally leads to suboptimal outcomes. And, we live, especially today, in a moment of scaling unlike we've ever seen before. And I don't know where that's going to lead, but we can talk about Bitcoin. Is Bitcoin too expensive at $100,000 today? I have a friend who says, "Are you kidding? This is the perfect time to get in." I'm not. I'm not suggesting one way or another. Is OpenAI or SpaceX at these valuations of billions and billions of dollars? Is it too late? I don't. I mean, it's an interesting question, right? I want to be able in my life to try and take a long term view on things, figure out a way to have cash flow, live, have savings. I don't need to lead an extraordinarily extravagant life. I get joy in investing things and seeing them grow. And so I just want to put myself in a position where I can take the long term view on things. And I yet ultimately believe that the value creation, if you've picked right and you've got enough targets out there, you're going to do great. And I think today is an extraordinary time to be thinking about things like that. And so you're right. If you had invested in Amazon after it went public, so everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, what about those people that got in pre-IPO?" Well, you could have made 1,000+ X on your money after it went public, right? And same with Meta, same with blah 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 blah. And so, what are the companies out there today that you could do that with? I mean, people think, "Oh, I want to do venture capital. I want to do venture capital is hard and super risky, and there's a lot of misalignment of interests." And so, generally speaking, I don't think most people should be doing it. Honestly, I mean, it's cool that it's available, but that's a whole different discussion. I think there's a ton of opportunity on more liquid public stocks, especially if you play the long term, like we're talking about. And I do believe that certain managers outperform, and I also believe, like Warren Buffett says, that index funds are probably still a great way, and that I do believe, and we're talking about long term, that there is magic in compounding returns, and people do not understand that they should remind themselves on a frequent basis what those charts look like. If you're getting 15% or some number over 30 years, you're going to have a lot of cash and a lot of reward for that long-term approach.
Absolutely. John, I want to mention another quote of yours. I think this might have been, you had this 3-minute video talking about your new company, Agate Hound Fund, and what you're doing there. You said, "It is what I want to do and nothing else." And so that's strong convictions for anything, really. So tell me about search funds, this world, because you're bridging. One of the reasons I wanted to interview you is because I've noticed this entrepreneurship through acquisition space, and I know that it's still in the early days. And search funds alone, there was a study published in 1984 in Stanford, and even since then, it hasn't gotten as much exposure as, say, venture. And so I've been fascinated by that. I've talked to a lot of venture-backed founders. I've worked at venture-backed startups, but I know this space right now. Now I turned 18 in June, and I've been thinking about how I can get in personally, because I think what you said with venture, it's like a hit and miss, and you have to back the exceptions and you have to find the outliers. Tell me about that world and why it excites you so much, and maybe what it is for the many that don't even know about it right now.
Yeah. So I am very passionate about it. Uh, and by the way, it's what I want to do for my business career for the rest of my life. I have lots of other priorities when it comes to friends and family, but you're right. It's in terms of I am not, I am not, I have defocused on the venture world and I am all in on the search fund slash entrepreneurship through acquisition. And it's funny because it was invented at Stanford by my professor, and it has evolved. Back then, it didn't have the same refined playbook that it has today. But the results have been extraordinary. I mean, there's 40 years of 35% net returns. I know of nothing else that can make that claim. And I don't think in 40 years it's ever had a down year because you're buying profitable companies and you're putting these MBAs who are very smart, who are very hungry, very motivated, who have just come out of business schools where they've got best practices, and you're surrounding them with mentors and coaches who have done it themselves, and you're buying companies like Warren Buffett would say at a fair price, and you're growing it and selling it ultimately to private equity at a much higher multiple where they're competing for the purchase. And it reminds me so much of what venture capital was when I started. The entrepreneurs are gritty, they're coachable, they're interested in getting feedback, they want to be better, they want to learn, and they want to be entrepreneurs. And back in the day, venture was very entrepreneurial. And part of it still is, for sure. But part of it today is I'm just going to go find a fast growing Series B startup and say I'm being entrepreneurial. But really, what I'm doing is I'm seeing if my options are going to be of value in 6 months. And if they're not, I'll go repeat and find another one and hopefully I'll get lucky. People who do search funds, we're buying boring mom and pop guys in seats kind of businesses. Um, everything from street cleaners to arborists to meter reading to, I mean, this is heartland, middle of America, small business, $2 to $5 million EBITDA businesses. And you're coming in and you understand as a searcher, as an entrepreneur who's going to buy this company and run it, that you are preserving legacy, that you're making sure employees are taken care of, and you're growing value, and you're maybe taking the company to places it wouldn't have otherwise gone because you're working with the people who are selling, you transition, but you're bringing fresh ideas, fresh energy, and maybe even as we move forward, tools from AI and other tech tools that will be game changing for small businesses. And so you're right, it is under the radar. More and more people are learning about this. We are in the midst of the greatest wealth transfer in the history of the world, with the baby boomers needing to exit their companies. And this is, in my mind, the golden age. And so I didn't want to miss it. I love being part of it. I feel so lucky to be part of it. I love the ecosystem and the ethics and the integrity of it and the true value add that the investors are providing, and the people who have had success come back, just like in the old days of VC, and they're investing back into it and providing that same kind of knowledge transfer and mentorship.
Absolutely. So if you're a young person seeing this, you're a young man or woman, you're like me, 18, 19, 20, 23, you're seeing the space, you're thinking, all right, you know what, people like John, they're saying it's the next hot thing. We're looking for the greatest wealth transfer. There are all these opportunities. Okay, how do I get it? Is the answer you go find a way to get into Stanford, do an MBA, and go in, or can you like just go in straight away and maybe work with a search fund or source your own deals, come up with some creative financing?
Well,
How would you break into something like this if you're just
it's a
a
great
normal
question.
young guy?
So, really, what we're talking about is ultimately acquiring and running a small business. I have a particular viewpoint as an investor on how I want to invest into that playbook. It's called the traditional search fund, and it is a very narrow playbook. Not everybody's going to go to Harvard, Stanford, Booth, whatever, top business school. But if you think you want to ultimately run a small business someday, go work for small businesses. But the great news is there are podcasts, there are books, there are resources available to people. If you get excited, if you really want to be entrepreneurial, look, I would say to a young person, if that's your goal down the road, okay, if that's what you're thinking about, then do things that will help you get there. Learn how to structure a deal. No matter what you do, you have to be selling. Learn the skills of selling, no matter where you are. It could be anywhere. They're applicable across, right? Be around entrepreneurs and learn how they're doing it successfully, right? And you don't have to jump right into a search fund. It's building the skill set, knowing that's where you want to be. And by the way, one of the things I did, Berg, early on was once a month, I would call venture people or startup people and take them to a coffee. So, you're doing it. What you're doing with this podcast is a way for you to learn about best practices, get inspired with people's stories. But I would encourage anyone who thinks that this is an area that they want to pursue, I'd start talking to people who are doing it, who own small businesses. I'd go volunteer for your YPO group and try and help them as they do their meetings. There's lots of ways to get in the stream of knowledge, right? And that's what I would encourage.
That's fascinating. So how does exactly, say, a search fund work, and how do you find deals? You mentioned like you're looking for these mom and pop shops. What are you doing to find these types of businesses? Like,
Yeah.
how do you do that? And
So,
how does a search
so
fund even work?
yeah. So what happens is there actually are courses at the business schools on search funds, on everything from exactly what you're asking. How do you find the companies? How do you negotiate the deal? What do you do in your first 100 days? How do you build a board? All the questions, right? And there are classes on this now. There are also conferences on it now. And I went to a few this fall. There are books on it. But what ultimately the mechanics are is you decide as a 1 or 2 person team coming out of one of these business schools. And again, I'm talking about the traditional search fund playbook. There are other ways to buy businesses. I'm being very specific in what we invest in and what I'm excited about. You come out and you raise a little money to pay yourself for up to 2 years while you search to find and acquire and ultimately run this $2 to $5 million EBITDA business. Okay, but you ask the question, how do you do it? I mean, brute force, partially, lots of emails, going to trade shows, calling friends, asking for referrals, using brokers, all those kinds of things. So that's ultimately, it's just brute force. Um, and by the way, of all the people who do it, a third or more don't even ever. So it is not a certain thing. It is hard. It is messy. Small businesses are often not what they represent they are, if you know what I mean. And so you have to be able to have people around you that know what to look for as well. And you have to have great processes and systems to go through this. And it takes a very special type of person who wants to do this. This is not for everybody. Believe me. I mean, when you take a graduating class at Harvard and there are 900 students or so, and 7 or some small number like that say, oh, I'll do a search, that should tell you this is not for the faint of heart. But the people who do it know they want to do it. They come in eyes wide open. They're excited about running something. They're entrepreneurial. This is what they've been thinking about for a long time, and they're ready for that challenge. And it's fun to work with those people.
Hmm. The last thing I want to kind of talk about is you've gone to two venture fund conferences as well as three search fund conferences in the last few months, and you got in early when venture was just starting out. So and you know how to spot the patterns. What are some contrasts or observations you're making about the two different industries, and what are some learnings you've had in the last past few
Yeah.
months?
Well, let me say this: technology right now is at this inflection point that we don't even understand. There is going to be so much change in the next 10 years. It is mind blowing what's about to happen. And I've been doing this for a long time, and I can honestly say this is another level. I'm excited about it. I think the wealth creation opportunities, that innovation and good that will happen is really potentially so exciting. But I don't, it's obviously attracted a lot of people. And I don't know how to invest in it the way I used to. I used to be very clear about my value add. I used to be very clear on how I could source deals. Sourcing deals is so important. There's two types of funds. You've got the mega fund, and now these emerging managers, and there's so many of them all competing. AI is taking over the world. I think at the last Y Combinator, 86% of every startup was an AI related startup. So you've got to really understand that world. And so I think for me, I had a great run, but and I went to the conferences, like you said, I went to Slush and I went to Web Summit, and there's cool stuff, and it's happening all over the world. That's the other piece of it. And that's great. Entrepreneurship is alive and thriving and growing, and I love that. Search funds, I also went to the Harvard and the Chicago booth search fund conferences. It's growing, but if Web Summit was 100,000 people, Harvard was 1,000 people. And search funds are necessarily smaller. It's not scalable, it's not tech, but it is super entrepreneurial. And it is attracting attention for people who are saying, maybe I don't want to go work for the man or the woman. I want to run something. I want to own something. I want to be a manager. And so it is a really interesting alternative to people's career path that previously seemed inaccessible. And honestly, it is at that point where venture was 30 years ago. And we're starting to see more interest. We're starting to see innovation on models. We're starting to see better playbooks being refined. It is such an exciting time. I often say to people when we're not raising a fund right now. Next year we'll raise our second fund, but I often say if I could take you to one of these conferences and you could meet the entrepreneurs and you could hear the excitement and you could see the types of work and companies that they're pursuing, you would want to be part of it. And that's what it feels like. It feels like that same energy, just to bring this conversation back, that I felt at Microsoft in the early days. And that's why I'm so excited.
So it's almost like if you're a young person and you haven't really heard of this world, but you've heard about venture-backed startups, and you're looking at what you want to do. It's almost worth just put yourself out there, go to some of these conferences, learn about it, and
Oh,
maybe go
yes,
work for a small business, maybe go work for a
for
search fund, just
sure.
be an
For
apprentice.
sure.
And
For sure. Well, I loved what you said earlier, Burke. Sometimes you just gotta go sleep on the blow up bed and the WeWork, right? I mean, that's what it takes. You're as a young person, there's only upside, right? The access to these things has never been greater. You're taking risk now as a young person is the greatest thing you can do. Because again, what's the downside? I even asked that today. What's the downside? Generally, not very much, but especially for a young person.
San Francisco is kind of like the place for startups. Is there like a hotspot now for
No,
these types of,
no.
or is it just all over the place? Like,
That's what's cool. It's everywhere. It's Omaha, it's Topeka. There's small businesses everywhere. And I love that because you're right. You go to San Francisco and you're once amongst many. But you go to some of these outlying areas that have cool small businesses. There's accounting firms, there's dental clinics, right? They're everywhere. So you don't, and so your competition is going to be quite different than you would find in other tech startups if that was the path you were pursuing.
There we go, John. That's it for the questions I've got. Anything else you'd like to talk about? Any stories, lessons, anything like that to end this off?
No, I'm just so thrilled to be living now at this time. I, I said I was all in on search funds. If anybody wants to talk to me about them or email me, hopefully you'll share my Agate Hound Fund information. Look, I believe that find a hero, continue to be inspired, know that family and friends are the richest part of it all, and go out and do great stuff and change the world. That's it.